On 30 December 1976, Barry Byron Mills was found guilty of bank robbery in Fresno, California federal court and sentenced to 20 years in prison. His court-appointed attorney, James Engstrom, did manage to get him off the charge of aiding and abetting robbery. He had been locked up in the Fresno County Jail since 12 October 1976. As a result of his conviction, a deputy U.S. Marshal transported Mills to Lompoc, California to begin his federal sentence. He was never to see a day as a free man till he died 8 July 2018 of heart trouble. The story is in between the day he was locked up and the day he was released at death. That is the story I'm going to tell you about. You might ask yourself how I know anything about Barry Mills. First of all, I spent months researching the facts of this video, and second, I was a guard at USP Marion, where Mills worked his way up the security classification of Supermax, or as we call it, the end of the line. I knew Mills for years and observed him going about his day for years. But that will come later in the story, and I'll get to it in time. But for now, let's go back to 1976. Mills started off his federal sentence at Lompoc Federal Penitentiary. He didn't play well with others, and in less than a year, he was shipped off to the federal prison island in Washington State. It was the same place that some of the gangsters of the 1930s were still serving time, and the future mass murderer Charles Manson would serve time. He would only be kept there for a few months before his proclivity to engage in gang activity would see him earn a transfer to USP Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. Warden Robbins had already signed off on the transfer when Washington, D.C. countermanded the order and had Mills shipped to USP Terre Haute in Indiana. Mills started his crap as soon as he arrived. He was already a very active member in the Aryan Brotherhood. It took just 3 months before Warden Ralston sent Mills to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, on August 29, 1978. It was thought by the bigwigs in the Bureau that the maximum security prison had the tools available to rein in the out-of-control Mills. His ability to organize and incentivize others to do his bidding were both his strength and weakness. He could get what he wanted, but at the price of being put under heavier and more robust restrictions. I can tell you that in the years that I watched Mills, deprivation meant nothing to him. He could have been a king, but chained to the floor of a bare room, and he would have considered it a victory. He continued to rise to the top of the pyramid of troublemakers. At Atlanta, Mills started the behavior he'd be best known for. February the 8th, 1979, an officer saw Mills hide a $20 bill near a shower area. He and another guard searched Mills and his living quarters for more contraband and found none. Not being satisfied, Mills refused orders, made threats by saying, quote, "I'm no snitch and I will square my business with you later," unquote. He got himself locked up in segregation for his attitude and threats. If he would have just let the officer do his job and let it go, it would have been a minor incident. But Mills just couldn't let things go. He had to show off for his homies in the Aryan Brotherhood. I'd hazard a guess that he would have made parole in August of 1984 if he had just lived and let live. But he had to dominate every situation, fight everyone and everything, no matter the long-term consequences. It seems to me that he demonstrated at this early part of his confinement that he was unable to understand the action he took today would adversely affect his future. Either that, or he just didn't care, and was willing to suffer any hardship to prove the point that he would never submit to anyone's will except his own. A threat against an officer was always taken in a gravely serious manner in my experience at USP Marion. I have no doubt it was treated in a similar manner at USP Atlanta. A little over 3 months later, on the 20th of May 1979, John Sherman Marsloff, was killed in the men's room of the recreation shack at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. His death was caused by 16 stab wounds in the head, back, shoulder, and upper arm area. The murder weapon was tossed into the commode, and a second similar knife, unused in the killing, was tucked under the arm of the victim. The details of the murder were reported incorrectly in an Atlanta newspaper. Although numerous witnesses testified to having seen Mills in the recreation shack area at the time of the killing, the only eyewitness was Danny Holliday. Holliday, the prosecution's key witness, testified that he had accompanied Mills to the recreation shack armed with the second knife for the sole purpose of robbing Marsloff, that he had been surprised by the murder and he had taken no part in it, was his story. The prosecution's theory of the case was that the murder of Marsloff had been committed pursuant to an Aryan Brotherhood contract. The Aryan Brotherhood is a white supremacist prison gang. It was originally organized as a defensive organization during the prison racial violence of the 1960s, but now attempts to control drug traffic within the prison system through violent means. The prosecution offered extensive testimony that in a drug transaction, Marsloff had cheated Tommy Silverstein, an Aryan Brotherhood commissioner, in another penitentiary, and that Tommy Silverstein had put a contract on Marsloff, and that this contract had been communicated to Mills, also an Aryan Brotherhood commissioner, by a letter channeled through someone on the streets. It included in prosecution's evidence to show Mills' membership in the Aryan Brotherhood was a letter Mills had written from prison using terms in the Aryan Brotherhood argot referring to ongoing Aryan Brotherhood activities and alluding to Mills' participation in other crimes. Mills maintained in court that he was innocent, that the Aryan Brotherhood had ceased to be an active organization, and that the murder had actually been committed by Robert Lee Hogan, another inmate. Hogan, who had committed several unrelated murders with sexual overtones, had confessed to Marsloff's murder several times. He had also confessed to other inmates, both corroborated and uncorroborated. Hogan was murdered in an apparent retaliation for one such killing several months prior to Mills' trial. The prosecution introduced extensive testimony to impeach Hogan's confession. Hogan's description of the details of the murder was factually incorrect, but identical to the erroneous report in the Atlanta newspaper. Hogan's psychological counselor at the Atlanta Penitentiary and her supervisor, the prison psychiatrist, testified that Hogan's psychopathy, well, there's a word for you, indicated he would have been incapable of Marsloff's murder, but was fully capable of falsely confessing to it in order to ingratiate himself with the Aryan Brotherhood. Both the prosecution and the defense at trial acknowledged unusual credibility problems. In the opening argument, the prosecution stated that substantial documentation was needed to explain to a lay jury the prison culture of violence, drugs, and secret gangs. During closing argument, and again in its brief on appeal, the government admitted that Holliday's testimony of his own involvement as an indicted co-conspirator who had plea bargained to a lesser charge was highly suspect. Prosecuting counsel urged the jury, during closing arguments, to believe only so much of Holliday's testimony as could be corroborated. Mills conducted his own defense with the assistance of a standby counsel. During his opening argument, Mills told the jury that he was conducting his own defense because, as an insider to the prison system, he could expose the lies prisoners told and the compromises they made with the prosecution in an effort to play the prison survival game. He tried repeatedly to elicit testimony on cross-examination that witnesses had agreed to testify for the government in order to obtain parole advantages and the safety and better conditions of the Witness Protection Program, or WITSEC. The prosecution countered with elaborate testimony concerning the government's witnesses' terror of the Aryan Brotherhood. Mills was convicted of the murder, and it was affirmed on appeal. A month after the murder, Mills was transferred to Terre Haute in Indiana. It was hoped this would lower the temperature in the segregation at Atlanta. Mills was stirring up trouble with his threats, and an organization to back it up. I don't think that the Bureau had yet recognized the extreme danger of the Aryan Brotherhood, and Mills, as one of the three leaders, or commissioners, posed to the prisoners and employees of the federal prison system. The intelligence section of the Federal Bureau of Prisons identified Mills as one of the leaders of the budding violence perpetrated by the ABs. In an attempt to get a handle on the violence, the Central Office ordered Mills transferred to USP Marion on the 5th of July, 1979. In just 2.5 years, Mills has started out at a low-security federal correctional institution and ended up at the only Level 6 Supermax penitentiary in America. If being self-destructive can be considered success, then Mills was a shooting star in climbing the ladder to the rarefied air of the Supermax prison. Less than 400 men at the time, out of tens of thousands housed at such a high security level. Mills was not just sent to the end of the line prison. He was sent to the control unit. That is literally the cell block at the end of a long corridor of cell blocks. He had graduated to the most secure and restrictive block of the most secure and restrictive prison in the entire nation. It was a place where the bars were painted black, the guards received special training, and given tools such as clubs that were not used anywhere else in the federal prison system. The control unit saw the murders of many prisoners. It was there where 2 guards lost their lives when they were stabbed to death by members of the Aryan Brotherhood in a single day. The place has been described as a very clean hell. Having worked there in the control unit, I can tell you that this is an apt description. On the 21st of April 1980, while housed in cell 10 of A range in the control unit, Mills flung his tray out on the range. He did this to show his contempt of the guards who had to pick up the trays from the floor next to the inside wrecked cages. It was his way of poking the bear. I have heard a lot since I started this channel about how bad people think the prisoners in the control unit were treated. There is never any discussion about how the guards were abused. We get spit on, have urine and feces thrown in our face, struck with objects. I have known that one of the prisoners tried to blow up, and of course 2 were brutally murdered. Don't talk to me about the poor prisoners. Mills and the other men in the control unit put themselves there by their actions and continued to be violent management issues while they were there. When they finally understood that they couldn't break the system, they were released gradually to lower levels of confinement. Some, like Silverstein, never learned that lesson and was confined in his own control unit for decades. A week after throwing his tray, Mills tried to throw urine on the same officer who picked his tray up off the floor. While he was at his piss throwing, he broke up his government-issued food tray and threw it onto the range in pieces. He wanted the officer to pick up the bits while he threw piss on him. Just another day of fun and games to pass the time in the control unit. He had previously slugged a segregation officer at USP Marion in the face that January and had broken the officer's glasses, and one of his teeth was spit out onto the floor. We call it spitting chiclets in prison. As in, he slugged Jones and he spit out his chiclets. Get it? In December of 1981, Mills was given 2 life sentences to be served consecutively. Most people think this means he has to die, come back to life, and serve another lifetime in prison. What it actually means is that his parole eligibility date was pushed back from 1984 to December 28, 1987. The court also sentenced him to the control unit until June of 1982. He would spend years at a time in the control unit. I've been told by members of the public that this never happened. Years in the control unit is supposedly unconstitutional, cruel punishment. It did happen, and was ordered by a federal judge to boot. For Halloween of 1983, Mills got the prisoners on the BD side of Charlie's cell house to flood the ranges. He yelled and yelled at the other prisoners to plug up their toilets and flush them continuously. Then to try to sweep the water toward the front of the cell house. Then, when the guards shut off the water, he ordered everybody to beat on their metal lockers and make as much racket as possible. All this to show that he was in charge of the place and not the officers. The Aryan Brotherhood had just killed 2 officers the few days before. The crackdown of USP Marion was underway, and Mills had decided not to accept the consequences of his gang's actions. None of this did any good. USP Marion would remain locked down until 2006. January the 10th of 1984, Mills was sent to the Federal Medical Center located in Springfield, Missouri. What was wrong with him is a guarded secret, since it is his medical condition. I can tell you he was confined to the hospital for almost a month, so whatever went wrong with him, it must have been something fairly serious. The government tries to keep prisoners in a hospital for as short a time as possible. His stay in the hospital must have fixed his issues, because by the middle of March, he started a major pissy fit. The problem that caused him to lose all control of himself was when he asked a correctional counselor for a phone call to his attorney. He did not schedule one like the rules said for everybody. He wanted one right away. When he was reminded of the rule, he asked to use his 1 call a month, his social call. But social calls are only to people on a prisoner's visiting list and not his attorney. Having not gotten what he wanted, when he wanted it, he just lost it and started acting out of control like some kind of fool. Now let me explain the painfully obvious. If you want me to do something for you, it makes sense to ask me, not scream orders and threats at me. Try this experiment next time you go to the post office. Push everybody out of the way in the line and stomp yourself up to the counter. Call the lady postal employee a bunch of vile names and demand she gives you a free stamp, or you will report her to her boss. Now if that don't work, tell her you'll get her later, and stomp out the front door of the place, kicking over all the stuff you can as you leave. See how that works for you, and get back to me and let me know in the comments, okay? As you can imagine, all this refusal to follow the rules meant that Mills spent many months in segregation, or I-Unit as we called it. Part of the routine in I-Unit is to have your cell searched very well, twice a week or more. During one of these inspections, 2 officers were using a metal detector to inspect the property in Mills' cell number 8 on A range. Inside a pack of cigars, they found a 5-inch piece of hacksaw blade. I don't mean to tell you how serious a security violation a hacksaw blade is in prison. I never did find out how he got that blade. Mills never saw the blade before and thinks it must have gotten into his property by mistake, since he doesn't smoke. Before you ask, yes, the prisoners were allowed to have tobacco up until the late 1990s. As a matter of fact, we used to give them chewing tobacco, plug tobacco, and loose tobacco and papers for free until 1998. I never did see Mills smoke, so he was telling the truth about that. I think he was a heroin addict, but he didn't damage his health with tobacco. We also gave the prisoners matches to light their cigarettes. They used the match heads to make bombs, guns that fired bullets, and set the place on fire from time to time. I can recall one officer who was almost shot with a match head gun, and one prisoner who had a chunk of his face blown off and an eye removed with a match head bomb. I thought it was a shotgun going off when I heard the explosion. By August of 1984, Mills had been let out of segregation and returned to the Charlie cell block. He got himself confused about the order of prisoners that were let out for recreation. Like most of the prisoners, when they get confused, they get angry. Mills threatened to stomp the throat of the officer letting the prisoners out for rec. The officer explained the procedure, but this didn't satisfy Mills. Rather than allow the incident report to go through as written, the on-duty supervisor reduced the charge to interfering with the orderly running of the institution instead of threatening staff. That is a very big reduction in the allowed sanctions. If I was the officer who wrote Mills up, I'd have had a real problem with that supervisor. As a side issue, I'd like to talk about the working conditions for the officers in the late 1980s and 90s. There was a church at the corner of Grassy and Prison Road. If two officers had an issue with each other, we could always go to the church and settle it. Long ago, I saw a movie where the cops would hang out at a bar and call it choir practice, the name of the movie being Choir Boys. We didn't have choir practice. We had take it to the church, or we could pray on it. So now and then, I'd see several cars in the church parking lot and a bunch of guards all jammed together. Naturally, I will never admit to witnessing anything more than talking going on, but some real serious issues got solved on that gravel parking lot while I worked there. I can say that's what happened there. It stayed there. One practice of all the wardens I worked for was once a week walk of all the ranges during an inspection. What this meant in practice was that all the department heads followed the warden as he walked into my cell house and checked it for appearance and function. He'd walk past each cell. This allowed every prisoner, once a week, to take his grievance to the warden, if he so wished. In practice, it usually meant that one of the people following the warden would address the prisoner's concern. The 3rd of October, 1984, Mills was in Charlie unit when the warden walked past his cell. The associate warden for programs was in charge of recreation. Mills stopped this associate warden and addressed his concerns about the recreation schedule that make him have a meltdown in August. He started to tell the associate warden that he would do a repeat of his prior misbehavior if his problem was not addressed. The AW was not kind to take even a veiled threat very well. He told Mills to get on with the problem and not tell him what would happen if he didn't get his way. Mills took this as a disrespect and started in his cell another pissy fit, yelling, "Fuck you, man," throwing and breaking stuff in his cell and generally acting the fool. What happened was nobody cared about his issue and he got dragged off to I unit again. You can threaten to kill an officer, but never, ever cuss the AW or your ass will be locked up before the echo dies out. In the end of October 1984, Mills was finally caught trying to pass a letter to other members of the ABs and got his mail privileges sanctioned. Here is a part of one of his letters he sent out in an attempt to communicate with other members of the gang. I won't bother to translate all the code or slang, or I'd be here a couple of more episodes in this series. I quote, "All right, brother, how you doing? As for me, all's the same old program, just in a different neighborhood. Presently, I'm doing a 2-year program here at Marion in the control unit. Yeah, they give me a couple bogus 187s down in Atlanta. Nothing they've been able to take me to court on yet. I did get through with an assault trial at Leavenworth. We fought it out ourselves and ended up with a hung jury. So, now I'm waiting to see if the U.S. attorney that way is gonna file for a retrial." A few of us have sworn off burnt spoons this way. We have a couple of new kids this way that we need to sit and rap about. We had asked that you fellas trust our judgment on the new kids this way, as we trust your judgment that way. It's just that sending the names through mail only puts the bottles on top of folks they need not be. Tommy and I will stand accountable for things this way, and all will stay on top order. I understand that Arizona is sending about 10 fellows this way that are claiming brand. Has anyone been able to get to the bottom of the story on that trip in Arizona? I've got a homeboy that way down and am attempting to find out how all that came about that way. If I end up going to trial down in Atlanta, it does look like I will be shortly. Do you want me to call you? I called baby out to my last trial at Leavenworth. What I'd like to do is call you, someone from the Bay, and someone from Palm Hall. I was thinking along the lines of you, Buff, and Rick. We do need to sit and rap a spell. Let me know your thoughts on that. Marion seems to be becoming home base for M and us. About 10 of them out this way. What's the story on things between them and us? I hope with all my heart things can be worked out with respect to all, as the bottles can gain any other way. Keep us posted. Well, I'll hush my mouth for now and fold this up on my love to kin and friends. That's the end of the Mills letter. On December the 10th, 1984, Mills had an apparent need to communicate with members of the ABs in I Unit. One way to do this is a violation of the rules. At 8 p.m., there's a prisoner head count. Mills refused to return to his cell. The count couldn't be done with Mills running loose on the range. The lieutenant came down with a couple of guards and cuffed Mills and took him to I Unit so the unit count could proceed. I can only guess why Mills needed to talk, to his homies and what about, but I'm sure he thought it was important enough to get locked up for it. September the 2nd, 1988, Mills and a prisoner by the name of Francis got into a fight in the dog unit on Baker Range. Two of Mills' road dogs, Wagner and Bridgewater, stepped in to save Mills and Francis from killing each other. Then all four got to pushing and yelling. Then Wagner and Bridgewater started fighting and Francis attacked Mills again. The guards had to smack the two couples a few times to, get them to stop long enough so they could cuff them and drag them away to I Unit. The physician assistant checked all four combatants and found no major injuries. The reason for the fight is not reflected in the official files. December 1994, USP Marion was in the process of being replaced by the new Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado. Marion would remain a Supermax prison until 2006, when it shut down for a few months to be refurbished and reopened as a medium security sex offender unit. On the 20th of December 1994, a bus came and took Mills and 30 or 40 others with a Supermax designation to the new prison. The end of the era of USP Marion being the only level 6 in the nation was over. I, and most of the other guards, were not happy taking care of the child rapists that replaced Mills and his kind. Perverts are harder to deal with than straight-up psycho killers. More than once I can recall telling somebody I missed the homicidal maniacs and had a deep hatred for the pervert child molesters. May the 18th, 1995, Mills was at his home in Colorado. He was ordered to provide a urine sample, but didn't. All prisoners in the Bureau are given random drug tests. Failure to provide a sample is a violation of the rules. It's not just the prisoners who have to submit to the random drug tests. All the guards were tested from time to time. Every now and then, somebody got caught using an illegal drug. Once they demanded a hair sample from a guard to prove his urine sample tested positive by some kind of error. The guy tried to cut off all the hair on his body. Now this is very difficult considering he had to shave every hair on every inch of his body. His excuse for cutting off all his hair was that he thought it was a new fashion he wanted to pursue. But he missed a few hairs on his back. He again tested positive, failed a polygraph, and was fired, due to drug use and lying during an official investigation. Good riddance to bad trash is all I got to say. November 23rd, 1998, there was a fight on the rec yard of number 113 for G Unit. When the officers arrived to quell the fight, Mills was ordered to lay on the ground. He refused and remained standing. Finally, the officers entered the area and used a stun gun on Mills to take him to the ground, cuff him behind his back, and again he was dragged off to segregation. The government makes a big deal and spent multi-million dollars on the prosecution of the leadership of the Aryan Brotherhood. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty. The ABs responded with a promise that for every one of them put to death, they'd kill 10 guards. I believe they were in deadly earnest. Some of the ABs at Marion told me that it was nothing personal if I had to be killed. Somehow, despite their reassurances, I took my own murder as very personal. In any case, they didn't have to carry through with their promise. In November 2006, the court finally reached a verdict and sentence. Mills was given a $400 fine and given life without the possibility of parole. He was convicted of murder, violent crimes in aid of racketeering, one count of Racketeer Influenced Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO as it's most commonly known. He was already doing a double life sentence at Florence, Colorado. It seems that the government spent millions of dollars to sentence men mostly doing life in prison. Adding another life sentence accomplished the political goal of convincing the public that the government was tough on crime. With nobody given the death sentence, it kept the ABs from having to murder some of the correctional officers and made the governments of Europe feel that America had become a bit more civilized by not killing prisoners. Everybody was happy with the outcome for a few $1 million spent. On July the 8th, 2018, Mills was housed in Joker Unit, cell number 3 of Florence in Colorado. The officer noticed that he was unresponsive during the 10 a.m. security rounds. He notified the security supervisor and the medical team who ran to the unit. The EMT assigned to work that day, R. Huddleston, did CPR and used an ambu bag to assist his respiration. They moved Mills to the trauma unit and used the automated external defibrillator, or AED, to attempt to restart his heart while they administered oxygen. He received top-notch care in a timely manner. Nothing more could have been done for him if he had been a U.S. president. His heart was so damaged that it couldn't continue to work, and he died peacefully. So ends the life and terrible reign of one of the leaders of the most violent and savage prison gangs in America. His legacy lives on in the daily terror the gang perpetrates in America's prisons today. The only good thing I can say about him is he didn't order me killed in all the years we interacted. For that one act, I'm grateful. If there's something you disagree with or want to research yourself, I encourage you to do so. Barry Byron Mills, born August 26, 1948, U.S. Marshal number 14559-116, has documents of his with the U.S. Records Administration in Kansas City and the Northeast Regional Director's Office of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This video has been brought to you by the very generous support of my Patreons. To them, I owe a great deal of thanks.